The call came on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not a Tuesday with storms gathering outside Kensington Palace or ravens circling the tower or any of the theatrical nonsense people imagine surrounds royal decisions. It was the kind of Tuesday where the sky was a flat, uninspired gray, where someone had left a half-eaten biscuit on the briefing room table, and where William sat reading a memo that was going to change, in the quietest possible way, everything. Nigeria. He read the word twice. Then, set the paper down. Then, picked it up again. It wasn't that the destination surprised him. They'd been in conversations about sub-Saharan engagement for months. Long, circular conversations in rooms with too many advisors and not enough windows. Conversations that produced action points and follow-up frameworks and very little else. He knew the trip was coming. He'd approved the framework himself. What stopped him was something else entirely. He thought about his mother. Not the version of his mother that lives in documentaries and think pieces and the careful prose of authorized biographies. The real one. The one who'd sat across from him at a kitchen table when he was 9 years old and said, "William, the thing about people is that they can tell when you're performing for them. They've always been able to tell." She'd been talking about something small, a school event, a thank you letter he'd written that sounded too formal. But he'd never forgotten it. He thought about Angola, the landmines, the footage of her walking through a cleared minefield in a face shield and protective gear that made her look somehow more human, not less. The way she walked, unhurried, deliberate, like the ground beneath her deserved attention. Like the people watching deserved the fullness of her presence, and not the managed version they usually received. He picked up his phone and called Catherine. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was at her desk. She always let it ring 3 times when she was with the children, for when she was in a meeting, she needed an excuse to exit. "I've just read the brief," he said. A pause. He could hear paper shuffling on her end. Then, the Lagos Community Health Initiative, and the education program in Abuja, and the state dinner. And the William. Her voice was even, grounded in the way it always was when he was starting to spiral into logistics. "When do we leave?" That was Catherine. She didn't ask, "Are you sure?" or "Is this the right moment?" or any of the 1,000 questions his own mind was already generating. She asked when. He exhaled. 6 weeks. "Then, we have 6 weeks," she said simply. And somehow that was enough. The official announcement dropped on a Thursday morning, routed through the Palace Communications office with the kind of careful, measured language that Palace Communications had been perfecting for a century. Words like deepening bilateral ties and celebrating the rich cultural heritage and commitment to Commonwealth partnership. All true, all correct, all about 40% of the actual story. The other 60% was harder to say in a press release. The other 60% was this: Britain had a complicated history with Nigeria. A history that didn't disappear because you stopped mentioning it. A history that sat in the room at every state function, that showed up in the subtext of every diplomatic exchange, that a certain generation of Nigerians carried in their bodies the way you carry weather and old injuries. You don't always feel it, but when the pressure changes, there it is. William knew this. He'd spent months understanding it. He'd sat with historians and cultural advisors and, more importantly, with Nigerians themselves, people who'd been invited not to brief him from a safe professional distance, but to talk to him directly, to say the things that don't make it into diplomatic frameworks. One of those conversations had stayed with him longer than the others. A woman named Dr. Adiz Okonkwo, a public health researcher from Lagos who'd come to London for a conference and agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to meet with him. She'd sat in a chair across from him with the particular posture of someone who has decided in advance not to be impressed. She wasn't rude. She was precise. "The question," she'd said, about 20 minutes into their conversation, "isn't whether you mean well. I believe you do. The question is whether meaning well is enough. And historically, speaking as someone whose grandmother was alive during certain periods I suspect neither of us wants to itemize today, historically, it has not been." He hadn't tried to defend that. There was nothing to defend. What would enough look like, he'd asked. She'd studied him for a moment, like she was trying to determine whether the question was genuine or performative. "Show up and listen," she said finally. "Not with solutions, with ears. And then, if you are actually going to use whatever platform you carry, use it for something that outlasts the photographs." He'd thought about that a lot in the weeks since. Something that outlasts the photographs. Catherine had her own preparation process, and it looked nothing like his. Where William moved through briefing documents and strategic frameworks, Catherine moved through people. She'd always been like this. Her instinct was never toward the macro, the political, the structural. Her instinct was toward the specific human being in front of her. The child in the hospital ward. The woman at the community center who was holding herself together with nothing but stubbornness and love. The teenager who didn't expect to be seen and then was. She'd spent 3 weeks talking to British Nigerian women. Mothers, artists, nurses, community organizers. She'd had tea with a midwife from Enugu who'd been working in the NHS for 22 years and who told her about maternal mortality rates in rural Nigerian states with the calm authority of someone who has long since run out of patience for statistics being treated as abstractions. She'd sat with that for a long time. That evening she'd gone into her children's rooms, George first, then Charlotte, then Louis, and stood in the doorways longer than she normally would, listening to them breathe, feeling the particular, almost unbearable weight of knowing that somewhere, a mother was sitting with a grief that shouldn't exist. A grief that was preventable. A grief that had a number attached to it in a report that would be read by people who would nod and move to the next agenda item. She didn't tell William any of this. He knew it anyway. They'd been married long enough that she didn't always have to narrate the thing he could already see on her face. What she told him, the night before they flew, was simpler. They were sitting in the kitchen, too tired for anything ambitious, sharing what had once been a pot of tea and was now just warm water with ambitions. The house was quiet. The staff had gone home. The children were asleep. "I want this to matter," she said. "Not to the institution. Not to the Commonwealth. Not to the polls or the press coverage or the long, complicated calculus of royal relevance in the 21st century." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things she meant completely. "To them," she said. "I want it to matter to the actual people." William reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Outside, London went about its evening. Cars and rain and the particular hum of a city that never fully sleeps. Inside, two people sat with the weight of what they were about to attempt. Not the pageantry of it, not the logistics, but the human core of it. The simple, terrifying ambition of walking into someone else's world and being present enough, humble enough, real enough to matter. 6 weeks of preparation for this. And still, it felt like not quite enough. Legos hit differently than the briefings had prepared them for. That's the thing about briefings. They are, by nature, organized, categorized, delivered in fonts that suggest control. Lagos, the actual city, the living, honking, cooking, building, arguing, laughing organism of it, was not organized. It was alive in a way that made organized feel like a smaller ambition. The motorcade moved through streets that pulsed. Not metaphorically, literally. The sound had a physical quality. The markets and generators and music and traffic all layering into something that pressed against the windows of the car. Catherine watched it with her face slightly forward, like she was trying to get closer to it through the glass. She'd been to cities before, dozens of them, hundreds of events, thousands of hands shaken in the choreographed dance of official visits. But there was something about Lagos that demanded you show up differently. It didn't make room for you. It simply continued, enormous and indifferent, and you either found your place inside it or you watched it from behind glass the whole time. She made a decision in the car. She leaned toward her senior aide, a woman named Priya who had accompanied her on every major international engagement for 7 years and who had the supernatural ability to anticipate exactly when Catherine was about to do something that wasn't on the schedule. "When we arrive at the community center," Catherine said, "I want a few minutes before the formal welcome. Is that possible?" Priya looked at her, looked at the schedule, looked back at her. "I'll make it possible," she said. The Makoko Community Women's Center wasn't the kind of facility that appeared in architecture magazines. It was a single-story building painted the particular optimistic yellow of places that have decided cheerfulness is a form of resistance. Inside, sewing machines, a small library of battered paperbacks, a notice board covered in photographs and children's drawings, and a hand-lettered sign that said, in English and Yoruba, "This is where we build each other." Catherine stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed her. The room was full. Women of varying ages, some with small children on their laps or strapped to their backs in bright fabric, sat in clusters, talking, working, nursing. One woman in the corner was teaching 3 teenagers how to cut a pattern. Another was on the phone, gesturing expressively at the ceiling while a toddler systematically dismantled her shoe collection beneath her chair. It was ordinary. It was completely, entirely, beautifully ordinary. And then someone looked up. And then someone else. And then the room did that strange, instantaneous thing rooms do when they become aware of themselves. But Catherine had walked in before the protocol could organize itself, before the center director could launch into the prepared welcome. She walked directly toward an older woman in the front row, 60s, maybe older, wearing a wrapper in deep green and gold, with the posture of someone who had never in her life been unsure of where she belonged. "Hello," Catherine said. Just that. The woman looked at her with calm, direct eyes. "You came inside," she said. "Of course," Catherine said.